So it's a great pleasure to introduce Chris Dyer, who's the former president of the BAHS, British Agricultural History Society, and it's customary to say that in introducing Chris that he needs no introduction, but I think it's worth just saying, drawing attention to his continuing publishing on themes of peasant housing, rural, social and agrarian organisation, and particularly landscape, migration and mobility, also new towns in medieval England, development of the pre-industrial economy, as well as medieval archaeology, and of course a theme that he's returned to a number of times and today about neighbourliness, neighbourly relations, and some of the problems of those in medieval communities. So if I can hand over to Chris now.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. You'll find my talk bears an uncanny resemblance to the previous talk, although it's in a completely different period and a completely different place. But it's nice to see these connections showing up. Historians of the medieval village tend to focus on the whole community when they think of neighbourly relations. We recognise cooperation in organising plough teams. We notice general agreements about field management, fencing off the arable, stinting the pasture, hiring and paying the common herdsman. These are all things that are done at a community level. And of course, the community is capable of all sorts of elaborate organisation and administration, assessing taxes, mending the roads, maintaining the parish church, organising poor relief, and so on. But these are what I would call multilateral relationships involving everybody in the village. But neighbourliness seems to me to differ from communal collaboration. It means small-scale interpersonal cooperation and joint enterprise between a small number of people. It's sometimes more than two, but I'll be focusing on ones involving two households. You might call them bilateral relationships. But I'm going to call this partnerships. It's something I've investigated recently. I should say that you get partnerships, of course, within the household as well. And Paul has mentioned that. And I'll give you examples of husbands and wives in partnership, but I'm focusing really on two partnerships, relationships in two separate households. Now, you can see evidence for this in joint tenancy. You find two people are recorded as sharing a holding. They appear in rentals as joint tenants. And one suspects quite often that they actually divide the holding and they're really just separate tenants, but they just happen to pay the rent together. But very rarely you find evidence of people holding land conjunctim, to use the Latin word, together, even occupying the same house and presumably sharing the work on the land. But I am here looking at the type of evidence which occurs quite commonly, but has not been given enough attention. These are records of disputes on a large scale, when you find two people, sometimes more, but I'll concentrate on two, flinging accusations at each other in the manor court. They pursue litigation simultaneously on trespass, on debt, on detained chattels, and all the other issues that can be raised in a formal piece of litigation. And you sometimes find 6 or even a dozen of these mutual lawsuits happening all at once. I believe that all the problems arose when people who had been in close association, people who had been working together, fell out, and then you get these orgies of mutual recrimination. So paradoxically, I'm using evidence of dispute in order to reveal previous cooperation. Now, at this point, Kathy is going to come up with an illustration. Because I'm going to take an example just to show you what these disputes look like. Kathy, is it coming up? There we are. That's great. Thanks very much. Right. So this is the text of one of these court records in which people are having a great argument. It comes from Tiverton in Worcestershire. By the way, a lot of my examples will come from Worcestershire, not because I'm a sort of Worcestershire nationalist, but because the evidence happens to be quite good from there. Now, this is between two people called tenants called John French and John Tandy in 1413. I don't know a great deal about them, but I suspect that each of them held a yard land or a half yard land, that would be 30 acres or 15 acres. So they come into that category, I think, of quite substantial people who have things to offer to each other, if you like, as Paul was arguing. They lived in a nucleated village with an open field system about 3 miles from the city of Worcester. So if you can look at the record, you'll see that they've fallen out over many matters, and they bring pleas against each other. They accuse each other in almost equal measures of trespasses and of a debt. They talk about corn being destroyed in a number of cases, often because animals have strayed over it. I like the way actually the court record talks about corn being destroyed. Of course, it's not being destroyed; it's being eaten. It doesn't look like destruction from the point of view of the cow or the pig who's it benefiting. Anyway, they have obviously impinged on each other in a very serious way, causing destruction and loss. And there's one case which I think is a telling example, which is of a footpath. If you look about halfway down, you see that John French is in mercy for having a lawsuit for having an unjust footpath across his corn. And I'm sure that this is a very characteristic way in which people once cooperated, you know, that French was given permission to walk across the land of his neighbour, and no one bothered about it. But of course, eventually, when they started quarrelling, this became impossible, and therefore the case was brought up in court. If you look at the next page, you'll see that what happened in resolution of all this. Well, first of all, you'll have seen on the earlier one that they all want a license to. They both want a license to agree. In other words, they have in effect taken the matter out of the hands of the jury of the court and are trying to find ways of settling it themselves by some sort of what do you call it? You know, some sort of arbitration. And what's happening at the end of the case is that the court steps in and, if you like, does what in the modern court we call binding them over to keep the peace, and imposing a penalty on them unless they find pledges and are restrained by those pledges. And at the end, they do submit to arbitration, and again they're threatened with a financial penalty if they don't agree with to settle their differences on the advice of the arbiter. Now, in some ways, this is a typical case, and you get these tit for tat, to and fro accusations of unneighbourly behaviour. It's an unusual case because there's actually some violence. Can we just have a look at? I'm sorry, I should have pointed this out. If you look at the previous page, thanks very much. You'll see that right at the end there, French got struck by Tandy and injured his finger. So it wasn't exactly a life-threatening injury, but nonetheless, some violence did take place. So they were obviously, more seriously at odds than is normally the case. And these elaborate peacekeeping measures are not normal. Let me go on then to talk about other cases. I've picked out 13 examples of these forays into litigation, and I will talk about those and pick out some more cases on a rather smaller scale. Now, what I'm trying to do is to look for evidence in these disputes, for evidence of the relationship that broke down, in the evidence for the cooperations that lie behind these rather dramatic, almost comical exchanges of accusations. Let's take John Cox and Thomas Jones of a village called Wolverley in 1389. They were quarrelling over straying animals and lost corn of the kind that we've just seen. A number of the complaints involved a meadow. One was that in 16 years earlier, in 1373, one of them Jones had damaged the meadow by allowing 6 oxen to go plodding around in it, presumably eating the hay. He also destroyed the meadow with his pigs. Cox had allowed beasts to harm the meadow, and Jones had also diverted a watercourse to the destruction of the meadow. There seems to be such a focus on meadowland that I suspect they were actually sharing a piece of meadow. They both had access to the same piece of land. Perhaps they were helping each other pay the rent, and they blamed each other when things went wrong, when it was mismanaged for various reasons. Jones said that if animals had got into it, it was because Cox failed to mend the fences. You can see or hear the recriminations being exchanged in the court. Jones was obviously trying to improve the meadow by diverting a watercourse, and something went wrong there. But the interesting thing is the revelation that the first of these cases went back 16 years. So they may well have been cooperating together for 16 years, and then the relationship soured, then they fell apart. Another aspect of neighbourly collaboration, once again, which you've heard about already, related to the sharing of tools, implements, and equipment. And it's a well-known problem, of course, for peasant farmers to be short of capital and not to have all the implements that they would wish, all the ones that they want to use. So in 1443, a man called Thomas ap Yate from the village of Cleve Prior, again in Worcestershire, fell out with William and Joan Judgment. Yates had borrowed traces for a cart, those are the leather straps to join the cart to the horse, and Judgment had borrowed a handsaw and a horse lock. In the same village in 1370, Richard Fisher had borrowed from John de Alvechurch a harrow, a harness, a yoke, and a scythe. He then proceeded to lose the scythe, destroy the harness, and broke the yoke, much, I'm sure, to Alvechurch's delight. Also, Alvechurch had also loaned an animal, and this, of course, is common as well. Alvechurch loaned a mare, which died. Alvechurch said it had been killed. And I suspect that, I'm thinking of what Paul Ward was saying, that a common accusation in the Middle Ages, as in 19th century Ireland, I'm sure, that is that if you borrowed an animal, you might overwork it and therefore cause its demise. Anyway, Alvechurch blamed Fisher for killing this poor mare, and he demanded its value, which he put at 18 shillings, which puts it at one of the most valuable mares in Worcestershire, and one suspects, as usual with these claims, greatly exaggerated. In return, returning just to this business of partners lending each other tools and equipment, you sometimes find this is connected with peasants who also work as artisans, you know, the people who combined their careers in agriculture, if you like, with a craft or industrial occupation. So you find at Wolverley, a man called John Seabright was involved with a man called Thomas Goodyear. And they were definitely both cultivators. They were growing grain. You find them owning horses, cattle, pigs and geese, because these animals strayed onto each other's land and caused damage and so on. But Goodyear was also contracted to saw wood. He was obviously doing it with a two-handed saw, you know, one where a big long saw for sawing up timber into beams and planks, which needs two people to operate it. So obviously these two were at each end of a saw, and they were one of them again was accused of breaking fences with his wain, which he was using to carry timber from which was on Goodyear's land. So, you know, you can see that they're bringing together the equipment they have to do this fairly heavy piece of work. And they're obviously in the business of preparing timber for sale. They're felling trees and cutting it up into pieces of timber for building purposes. In their farming, Seabright was accused of breaking fences around a close, pasturing animals. It looks like a problem arising. The animals are damaging corn. And it looks like a problem that might arise during the harvest, with animals being put onto the stubble early. You know, the animals go onto the stubble as soon as the corn has been cut. But if the corn is still, some of the corn is still standing, it may be the animals may eat some of that. And this is a general problem in the common fields, in the open fields, but this seems to be a matter between two users of the same close, because Wolverley is in the woodland landscape of North Worcestershire, where a lot of people held closes or crofts. And you find the same thing happening in a similar part of Gloucestershire, a village called Stoke Gifford, in 1423, when you find there's a series of trespasses and offences committed by a man called John Perns against a man called Thomas Lilly. The interesting thing about Lilly is that he was a vicar, and obviously a vicar with a glebe could well be, in his spare time, if you like, a peasant, managing land, keeping animals, growing corn, and so on. And so the accusation in this case, again, hinged around a close, putting cattle into his close so they depastured the grass, entering the close, sheep depasturing the close, carrying straw and hay, presumably from the close, entering the close with cattle and pigs. Again, you see there, they seem to be working together, holding a close, sharing this enclosure, and offending each other by breaking the rules that they'd surely agreed among themselves to separate the animals from the crops, but obviously those arrangements had broken down. The lives of the the lives of these partners were obviously very closely intertwined. One can't always be sure that they lived in the next house, but obviously in many cases they did, and that they would be neighbours together along the village street or in a hamlet somewhere. The example I have here is from Chaddesley Corbett in Worcestershire in 1401, when Richard Newman fell out with a man called William Clark, And again, there are the usual stories of animals eating crops. Clark's unsupervised goat ate trees growing in Richard Newman's holding. So, you know, there's a particular problem with that particularly antisocial animal. Clark's dog killed Newman's boar. It looks as if they've been living together, sharing assets, perhaps to mutual advantage, and they could tolerate a certain amount of these incidents of animals causing damage to the crops and so on. But when things went too far, and the death of the boar might have been the moment when their friendship ended, you then get the claims and counterclaims against one another. On a more positive note, you can sometimes get bits of evidence of people actually working together rather than simply of quarrelling and having to, if you like, reconstruct their cooperation on the basis of the things about which they quarrel. These cases come from a village called Ombersley, again in Worcestershire. In 1387, a man called John Mock prepared an acre of land for sowing by William Atter Parsons. Obviously, one was going to do the ploughing and the harrowing, and the other one was going to sow the seed. It looks again like an agreement to work together in cultivating a parcel of land. And in the same village, John Walker was obviously holding a croft from a man called Thomas Baker. It's presumably some sort of subletting arrangement. But they're also cooperating over the use of animals, and Walker borrowed 2 oxen from Baker, and Baker borrowed a horse and bridle from John Walker. So there's an exchange, if you like, of animals. They're clearly working together until something went wrong. There's quite an interesting examples where wives are also involved, and one gets a glimpse of the husband and wife working together as well as with neighbours. I want to go back to 2 Wolverley characters, John Cox and Thomas Jones, who I've mentioned earlier. One of the accusations was that by John Cox was that Thomas Jones owed his wife 1.5 bushels of rye. Now it's possible that she was dealing in grain, but I think it's much more likely, because this rye was Wolverley's bread grain, that she was baking bread for the Jones household. And this is very clearly set out in another case from Cleve Prior in 1443. Again, we've met these people before. Joan Judgment had agreed to bake bread and brew ale for the elderly Thomas Atter Yate, whose own wife perhaps had died or was disabled in some way. Joan's wage for doing this brewing and baking work was 3 and 4p, which would suggest that she'd been working for Yate over a number of months. But perhaps the original informal agreement didn't involve money at all, but that Atter Yate would compensate Judgment by some favour, say letting him pasture animals on his grass or whatever. But the relationship broke down, so a financial claim was made, no doubt inflated. That the amount of work would have been exaggerated, and therefore the 3 and 4p shouldn't be taken too seriously. All these pleas of trespass and detention and debt came with a price tag. The loans of tools, the access to pasture, the trespasses by animals were all priced, and with additional sums of money for damages. This financial dimension connects with our records of disputes and broken promises with an accounting device sometimes called a counter, whereby at stages of dealings between peasants or artisans or others, they would value favors that they'd done to one another, work that they had done, goods that they had delivered or borrowed, rent that they'd owed, and they would work out the different these mutual favors and see if their values cancelled each other out. And if they didn't, one of them would pay some money to the other. There's an example from Chaseley in Gloucestershire where two villagers, Richard Paul and Thomas Bartolot, had been going in for trading ventures, and they'd obviously pooled their money to make capital, and the time came when, after the transactions were all over, perhaps they'd been dealing in grain, I don't know, that's a guess. Anyway, when the transactions were all ended, they calculated that Bartolot owed Paul 2 and 6pence. And I suspect quite a number of this tit-for-tat litigation was actually aiming at that sort of final financial settlement, when, after a whole lot of things which had not been a relationship which had not been based on cash was cashed up, so to speak, then a sum of money could be calculated at the end. So I'm ending. My conclusion is that in the public sphere, recorded in manorial documents, and in particular in the manorial court, peasants can be seen as individuals holding a piece of land, responsible for rent, responsible for its cultivation, but also as part of a village community with obligations to all their neighbours, obligations to keep the rules. The litigation I've been presenting reveals informal, unofficial sphere of life in which neighbours and partners interacted. Dozens of such partnerships existed, I'm sure, at any time. Small-scale, short-term contracts, others long-lasting and continuous. But we only hear about them when the partners fell out. I suspect that 95% of these partnerships were undocumented. All we are seeing is, sorry for the cliche, a tip of an iceberg, and that the partnerships were normal, general, happening all the time, and we just hear about these cases when things went badly wrong. That's what Paul said as well. Peasant holdings and their tenants were incomplete on their own. They lacked the full range of equipment, livestock, resources, skills, expertise, labour, and they needed these to yield their full potential. Partnerships gave individuals the means to overcome those deficiencies. They could link up with a partner who had complement them in the equipment or in the time or labour that he had available. But the arrangements were informal and fragile, and on occasion they fell apart. But when they do fail, we can use them, those failures, to glimpse earlier successful collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. We've got a couple of questions in the Q&A session. I don't know whether to go to those first or whether there's also Carlo has his hand up as well. I might go to Carlo first, Kathy. Are you able to?
He's gone to the top because he's got his hand up. Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say just whether we can unmute him and he can ask a question.
Yes. Carlo, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, but I don't have a question.
Oh, okay. Right, okay. So it's phantom hands. I've got two questions here in the chat which I can just put to Chris. The first of those is from Nicholas Moore, who's been working on Suffolk coroner's rolls, and he suggests that the homicides peaked in October after harvest, during which people had worked closely together. Has Chris come across any record of disputes escalating into such extreme violence, sort of potentially at that time of the year?
Well, it's a good idea, and I'm sure that if I spent more time on the courts that deal with death and murder and so on, I might find cases. But no, I'm afraid I haven't. As I say, the injured finger is the most serious attack. But well, one can see that people's patience might snap and they might do something really awful.
Okay, so we've probably not got an Archer's plot here building at this point. The other question I've got is from Jose Luis Martinez Gonzalez, who has a question about the breakdown of neighbourly relations. Is there anything to do with geography there, or soil type, regions of heavy soil as well as light soil? Is it, soil type? I mean, the other thing is potentially, open field agriculture as opposed to enclosed areas. Is there any variation that you can see there, or is it the same sort of pattern across the area that you're looking at?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's one I've thought about a lot. There's a hint, I think, in what I said, that there is a connection between a number of these disputes and people living in woodland landscapes.
¿Qué dice? Me está contestando. Le he hecho la pregunta, me está contestando. ¿Qué dice?
Jose, you're not muted. Jose, do you want to talk?
Just a moment, please. Que no has apagado el micrófono, que si quieres decir... No, pon el... Sorry, no, we're going to mute. Okay, sorry.
Okay. Anyway, Chris, do you want to?
Can I finish?
Yes.
Can I complete it? Yeah, I mean, there's quite a number of them involve disputes involving closes and crofts and so on, which are the enclosed fields that you find in woodland landscapes. So perhaps these are more prone to that sort of toing and froing between two individuals and so on. In an open field area, perhaps you have more you have relationships with a larger number of people, with the whole community. But I did give you examples, in fact, from champion country, open field villages like Cleve Prior. So it's not exclusively, but I think probably there's something to be said for these problems being particularly prevalent in the woodland landscape, with dispersed settlements of the kind that Paul was talking about, dispersed settlements, enclosed land, and perhaps more bilateral and less multilateral relationships.
Okay, thank you very much. Do we have a question? Does Grace?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, so I was just wondering, Chris, have you noticed particular changes in the natures of these disputes sort of across the period? I know you're looking sort of quite late medieval, but some sort of from the 14th to the 15th centuries.
Yes, I should have said something about the chronology of these. You may have noticed that I kept on quoting examples from the late 14th and early 15th century, and it is for reasons which are not entirely clear to me, there is a concentration of these cases between about 1360 and 1450. I mean, there's a good reason why you don't find them much after 1450, because litigation tends to diminish in the court record. So there's no litigation about anything by the time you get to about 1500. And I'm sure that the relationships and the benefits of cooperation and the disadvantages of quarrelling, these are prevalent, I'm sure, in the late 15th and into the 16th century, but I'm afraid they just don't show up in my record. The court changes character, and so one loses this type of litigation. Earlier, I can't explain this, but there is, if you like, there are certainly lots of disputes and mutual recriminations, but you don't have that same tit for tat pattern of large numbers of cases all concentrated together before about 1360. But of course, I'm talking, of course, about one region. I'm very much dependent, in fact, on the estates of Worcester Cathedral Priory, where most of these records come from. So it may be a peculiarity of that particular estate. Oh, come to think of it, I've read quite a lot of records of other estates, haven't I? No, I take that back. It's not a peculiarity of that particular estate, but it may be something you would find in other regions. You might find earlier cases.
Chris, is there any evidence that these are also correlated with, you know, periods when we know there's, you know, so if you like, an economic breakdown or bad harvests, or, you know, is any of this related to economic stress creating the breakdown of long-term relationships which had endured over a number of years?
Yes, I've looked for that, and I honestly can't see it. Those years that I was quoting to you, 1389 to 1373, they have no great significance. I mean, within that period, you might find if stress of economic hardship and so on was a problem, one might expect to see something happening in 1438, 1439, when there is a run of bad harvests, and one might expect to see the results of that. But there isn't. I don't think there's a single case in that period. So it doesn't coincide, it seems, with economic stress.
Okay, thank you very much. Just juggling between things here. We've got one. Susan Kilby, are you there? Do you want to ask your question, or do you want to? Or it's a comment, really. So we've got a comment there from Susan Kilby about. Are you there? Yes, you are.
Susan? Hello?
I think she's there.
We can hear you.
I think it's.
No, she's gone.
No, it's muted again, so I don't know whether we can unmute it.
Henry, do you want to read out the question?
Well, it's a sort of comment, really. But so she's often wondered why two individuals escalate issues via the court over long periods, especially as it's expensive. And she's got a Walsham dispute which culminates with one man's horse biting his opponent's horse. Why do you think people continually resort to court? To save face in front of their neighbours, perhaps, or to try to recoup some of the money spent on litigation, or simply to gain the upper hand publicly?
Yes, that's interesting. I mean, I've obviously thought about whether there was some element of sort of public humiliation involved in these cases, but I mean, to the modern observer, the whole thing is rather comical, isn't it? These two people sort of accusing each other, but obviously that's not the way it came across in the 14th century. They were taking it very seriously. But I was very taken by Paul's oral evidence that people who are sort of nasty people, bad-tempered people, found it difficult to cooperate. You know, and it's a fairly obvious point, but it's obviously one that one can't really apply in the Middle Ages. But it's unfortunate that sources don't say he was a very nasty man. You know, but obviously there is some element of personality there. But I would like to take up one point, which is that, again, it's arising from what Paul said, which is that the people who are quarrelling tend to be equals. They're people of similar standing. They are yardlanders, half yardlanders. They come from the sort of middling ranks and higher ranks of village society. You don't find many cottagers or smallholders involved, or the very, very big people, the mean farmers and so on. So it is it does seem to be a feature of society at that sort of level that I suppose they're more in need of neighbourly cooperation, and perhaps they are, as Susan seems to be suggesting, more sort of aware of their reputations, if you like, and anxious to defend themselves against the neighbour with whom they have fallen out.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we better move on now.